Live everywhere on netrootsradio.com. David Waldman, Kagro, in the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday. Now Thursday. Just checking. Thursday, July 22nd, 2021. Strong temptation to say 22 because of that. But, okay, we got it right. That's good news. We're back on the air live. Missed you yesterday. Missed you. How was it? How'd you like brought you a rerun, and it was kind of an interesting discovery on Tuesday night in engineering the whole thing. Realizing, oh yeah, that's right. We took off last July 21st also. And of course, birthdays, one of those things that just kind of is an annual event. And we were, like mid-pandemic at the time. And it just seemed extraordinarily important to make an effort to get there for the birthday. And now, of course, we're at the big 90 for my father-in-law. So happy birthday to him yesterday. Of course, we went and wished him best, and we got the chicken from the good chicken place. Made it in time, barely, but we did make it, and it was good, and we all enjoyed it. And should we plug the chicken place? Will they send us chicken? I mean, I would do it for chicken, quite honestly. It's the Mickey Tavern outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, where we picked up the chicken. And it was real interesting because that prompted me. I was talking to Scott about it yesterday. He was wondering, what's the good chicken place? In case I'm ever there, I'll get some good chicken. And he, in return, told me, in case I'm ever in Ohio, I doubt you'll ever get to this small town in Ohio, but you should maybe try this place, or if you're ever planning to go there, find out what it is. Barberton, Ohio, as it happens. But anyway, the Mickey Tavern is outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. That place I've been to. Barberton, Ohio, I have not. But good chicken, I just happened to notice because when he was saying, oh, it looks good, I figured, I guess he looked it up on Google or something. And I've never Googled the place, and I'm just sort of curious as to what would come up. And like with everything else, you get those reviews. No matter how good a place is, there's always somebody who's totally panned it. And if you're really, new to a place or new to a thing, any product or service or, outlet of any kind that's got reviews online, even if you love it, if you think it's the greatest thing ever, there's somebody always who's panned it. And usually it's for petty reasons, too. Sometimes it's entertaining to read those things. It's just amazing that this is truly one of the better, I guess really the best fried chicken that I've had, where I know where it was from and I can go back and get more. But no doubt there were some reviews panning, and they were pretty highly ranked in the search too. And I ran into one of them right away, and it's just amazing when you see some place that's really terrific getting reviews like, don't go to this place unless you want to puke. It's the worst ever. It's the most disgusting thing I've ever tasted in my entire life, and I can only imagine what might have led them to leave such a review. But usually it's people that, I don't know, for whatever reason were thrown out or something. They have some other grievance against the place, so then they go and they leave a review saying that the food is bad. But that's not what we came here to discuss. Of course, we missed a key day on the air yesterday, but we're, busy trying to catch up with it. Yesterday's, I guess, big story was that the clowns having been recorded in the manifest of the Republican clown car, that is, the appointments to the January 6th committee in the House made by the Republican Party, made with every intention of disrupting the proceedings and turning the whole thing into a circus. And I think everybody knew that was the case. Everybody knew that was going to be the case. Everybody knew when they were delaying in naming their committee members that they were sorting through index cards somewhere, trying to decide what's our best bet for disrupting things without, for instance, adding more to our own woes with Republican problems. I'm sure originally they thought, well, let's put Marjorie Trader Green on the committee. We'll put Matt Gaetz on there. We'll put Jim Jordan on there for sure. I guess Trey Gowdy isn't in Congress anymore, so we can't do that. But, they're usual merry pranksters. Except in the interim, they've run into problems with Green having been booted off all the committees and Gates turning out to have been a sex trafficker and possibly a pedophile at that. And they just thought, gee whiz. Those two we can't put on there. But Jim Jordan, sure. But as it turns out, the other nominations for the other slots turned out to be, almost, certainly, if not as well known, clearly as malignant as Jordan could be. And as it turns out, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, I don't know if you knew that, did I? But I'll let you all know. She's been elected Speaker of the House. Everyone, certainly listening to the show, knew that she had the opportunity to say, well, Democrats just might not accept these appointments. Ultimately, it comes down to passing a resolution accepting the nominations made by the two parties and nominating them formally then to the seats on the committee, and Democrats in the majority. If we decided we weren't going to accept 1, 2, all 5, whatever number it was that they were putting forward, then, that would be it. You basically, they just wouldn't get those seats. So, although that's something rarely, if, and maybe even never, done, this is also a unique situation. So we knew that the opportunity existed. We just weren't sure whether it was something that Democrats would exercise. They could certainly have said, well, we know these people will turn it into a circus, but we are loath to get in the way of these, even saboteurs from being nominated to the committee, and everyone will see them for what they are and you for what you are for nominating them. But they really don't see that. So in this instance, Nancy Pelosi, taking the heat for the entire Democratic caucus, said, well, I'll just tell you outright that Jim Jordan and, is it Banks? Is that the name of the other guy? I told you they were pretty much unknowns when named, except for Jim Jordan. Unknown to me, and, I watch pretty carefully. Banks is the correct last name. Jim Banks, Republican of Indiana, said to have been tapped to serve as ranking member of the panel. That too, by the way, up for consideration on the House floor. Ordinarily, these resolutions don't come straight out and name who's going to be the ranking member. And if I recall correctly, many of them don't even say who's going to be the chair. But traditionally, the people understood to be in contention for those spots are listed first by the party nominating them on the, and it doesn't guarantee anything, but whatever. So that was clearly their intention. Democrats under Nancy Pelosi's leadership simply said, well, we're not going to allow that to happen. And it erupted into pretty much the fight that everybody figured would ensue. So I'll read a little bit about it here, but before I do, I'll note for the record that Bill has sent us our morning tweet here, and we could take an entirely different direction here if we want to. It says here that the Kagro in the Morning radio show, now being live, there's breaking news to report that I, Kagro X, had just got booted from the January 6th committee myself because Speaker Pelosi determined that he's the one who took the Capitol lawnmower and never returned it. Disappointing but valid. Right. She'd have every reason in the world to do that. By the way, if you search my garage, you'll find nothing but a push mower, like the old style push mower that I don't even know. When I bought it 25 years ago, I guess, I don't think I was 100% certain that hardware stores would actually still carry such a thing, but they did. Our patch of grass, such as it was even then, and it's diminished since then with some patio paving, even then wasn't big enough to warrant a power mower of any sorts, and we were in fact cutting the lawn with a weed whacker until we realized, gosh, this is just so uneven and terrible looking. So you can have it back, but it is, like Abraham Lincoln era lawnmower, but maybe it's historical and they want to keep it in the in the Capitol Rotunda or in the crypt beneath. Anyway, that's where we now stand. I'm off the committee, and that's how we're dealing with this morning. More discussion about just the sheer lunacy of the whole thing. I'll give you the background we'll start this way. I'll read you the Politico piece that'll lay out the basic facts of who was nominated and the fact that they were blocked. And then we can talk about how the rest of the press reacted to that. You've already seen it by now. It's been insane, and the traditional media normalization of everything that Republicans do is pervasive in the coverage. I mean, a lot of writers have been able to point out the partisan nature of the appointments, true, but for the most part, most of the discussion anyway has been about coverage like Chris Celiza's, which I guess started out with, where's his headline? I have a tweet in here somewhere that features his headline, but yeah, you should have seen some of these things yesterday. I think his Celiza's take on it was, Nancy Pelosi just doomed the already tiny chances of the 1-6 committee actually mattering. Is that the headline that they ended up with? Yeah. So definitely a couple of writers saying, oh, well, she's the one who blew up the whole bipartisanship thing by rejecting these things. And it's quite ridiculous, honestly. All right. Let's see. Yeah. What's interesting? Oh, look at this. Breaking news, I guess. Behind the scenes from Justice here, but as it turns out, he was trying to tell somebody else. But it is interesting breaking news. What's up with this? Are you in trouble with one of the social media outlets for having used? This is I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't reveal it. I'll wait for the thumbs up from Justice saying it's okay to reveal the thing. But just another one of those situations where you end up in trouble with, YouTube or Facebook or something for posting something that was, it's probably one of those situations where you post something and say, isn't this ridiculous? This is such terrible misinformation. Look at this. Or it's, here's somebody pointing out terrible misinformation that's being circulated. And then people are finding themselves, in Twitter jail or banned by Facebook for distributing COVID misinformation when what you were distributing was an article about how bad COVID misinformation is. For instance, this COVID misinformation right here, that sort of thing. All right, I'll jump back then to the story of Pelosi dealing with the committee nominations. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, remember her? Yeah, we were just talking about her. Stunned the GOP, really didn't, on Wednesday by vetoing two of the House nominees, two of House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's choices for a select panel investigating the January 6th Capitol attack, a move all but guaranteed to spark a Republican boycott of the probe. And they were planning for it. They were hoping for it. Nobody really wanted to serve on the thing. They debated for the longest time whether they should boycott from the beginning. And they must have focus grouped the thing and found out, oh, no one's watching. We need to blow this up by first appearing to cooperate with the idea of establishing a committee. And truly, I guess, to use the terminology sometimes used in these situations, these press analyses, whose term is it that we're using here? The view from nowhere, right? It really seems like the view from nowhere. This idea that yesterday's events were a starting point or even a turning point, really, in the partisan battle over investigating January 6th is ludicrous. I mean, we're only here. There's only an opportunity to name Republicans to this committee because the actual bipartisan attempt to come to the table with Republicans and negotiate an independent commission that exists outside of Congress, which they even conceded should be comprised of equal numbers of members appointed by Democrats and Republicans. This despite the fact that the Republicans who demand equal voice on the committee were the ones who perpetrated the insurrection anyway. But we decided to give the defendants equal say in impaneling a jury, and they still wouldn't do that. And because they wouldn't agree to do that, after agreeing to do that, and then running away from it, in full view of everyone, including all these reporters who now say it's Nancy Pelosi who blew up the bipartisan approach to things, we were only appointing members to this committee because the Republicans had refused to cooperate or even honor their own promises to cooperate on the commission in the first place. And that's all chucked out the window for a Nancy Pelosi doomed the committee headline. Now, again, that's not the headline on this piece. This is more or less straight ahead from in the headline anyway. Pelosi vetoes Banks, Jordan for January 6th Select Committee. So Pelosi rejected Jim Banks of Indiana, who was tapped to serve as ranking member, and Jim Jordan, both of whom voted to challenge certification of President Joe Biden's electoral wins earlier this year. Her decision sent shockwaves through the House because it's generally not done. Usually you just jump out of the way, however stupid these appointments look from the other side. Her decision sent shockwaves through the House and is likely to galvanize House Republicans against any participation in the investigation. It has. I mean, that was part of the plan. Now the five, and it's important to divide them this way. The five say, well, then if our two buddies don't go, then none of us will go. And I don't know. I mean, I sometimes I can't tell whether journalists who write up stories under headlines like the one Salissa asked for or ended up with, I don't know, they all remember, I think, I mean, unless they're complete idiots, that Liz Cheney is on the panel, having been named by Nancy Pelosi. I mean, before the Republicans ever made their nominations, the panel was already bipartisan. Under their rules, if one Republican shows up for it, it's bipartisan now. And it was Nancy Pelosi who did the bipartisanship. I caught you red-handed doing bipartisanship. And that's all discounted too. Again, the view from nowhere, everything that happened beforehand, all context eliminated. And it is Pelosi who, look what you made us do. You made us boycott this committee because it's no longer bipartisan, but it is because Cheney is going to be there. It's just that Cheney, though she's a Republican, knows who's really guilty in this and chose to participate in this, having been named by Democrats, despite the fact that she's a Republican. And she knew that was her only chance to do it too, because you'd never name her because you'd be afraid she'd actually tell the truth on you in the committee's investigation. Anyway, back to the recitation of things. Where are we now? Pelosi's statement. I must reject the recommendations of Representatives Banks and Jordan to the Select Committee. The unprecedented nature of January 6th demands this unprecedented decision. Another Republican, freshman Troy Nehls, Nehls, total mystery to me, also voted not to certify Biden's win, but Pelosi said she is prepared to appoint him, as well as Representative Rodney Davis of Illinois and Kelly Armstrong of North Dakota, both of whom voted to certify the election. And I did notice that I think in reading through Salissa's piece, he says, he attempts to tar Pelosi with this idea that she was somehow going back on her word about what criteria would be used in deciding, who Democrats would accept on this committee, except it's been 100% consistent. But here, too, in this Politico piece, they appear ready to try to say, well, obviously, the one criterion that mattered was whether or not they voted to certify the election. Democrats would obviously want to exclude any Republican who voted not to certify the election. And Pelosi, I guess, had said, well, there are actually other criteria that I'm looking at, and past votes aren't actually necessarily one of them. And so now they have, okay, well, Nels got on there, or Niels, or however he pronounces it, even though he voted not to certify the Electoral College. But these other two voted to certify it, so understandably they're on, but it's a big mystery as to how Nels is on there. And anyway, we'll read through the Politico thing, and I'll hopefully try and keep in mind what did I want to mine from the Cillissa piece when we get around to that. McCarthy issued a scorching reply that made clear he would yank his other 3 picks if the speaker didn't walk back her veto of Banks and Jordan, a move she's highly unlikely to make. This was reported, I guess, as of yesterday, denying the voices of members who have served in the military, for God's sake, and law enforcement, as well as leaders of standing committees. Woo-wee! Like, there wasn't enough honorifics to go on. Well, some of these people haven't served in the military or in law enforcement, but they are leaders of standing committees. Like, that matters. Has made it undeniable that this panel has lost all legitimacy and credibility and shows the speaker is more interested in playing politics than seeking the truth. Well, I don't know. The same could be said for you. That's what McCarthy's statement said. Unless Speaker Pelosi reverses course and seats all 5 Republican nominees, there are 6, Republicans will not be party to their sham process, but we will be party to a sham audit in Arizona and as many states as we can get to copy them, apparently. He later made clear in a press conference that, quote, we will run our own investigation, touching on the Capitol's lack of preparedness for the riot and prevention of a future attack. The Capitol, you see, wore a short skirt that day, and it's her fault that she was attacked by Republicans. Armstrong, for one, didn't mince words about Pelosi's rejection of Banks and Jordan. Who's Armstrong again? I've already forgotten. Oh, yes, right. One of the North Dakota Republican who voted to certify the election and who Pelosi was okay with had to prove she was cool enough to remain a Republican and get up there and criticize Pelosi. She uses the BS word, which Greg loves to do, but I don't. Unless, of course, my microphone is off, in which case it's every other word out of my mouth. Jim Banks and Jim Jordan have every right to serve on any committee Kevin appoints them to. Yeah, Kevin! Go, Kevin! Kevin! I need that as a... Somebody grab me the Home Alone thing every time McCarthy does something. Whenever Speaker Pelosi uses the word unprecedented, they say it's code. It's code for her consolidation of absolute power. Armstrong added, that's really something. The Capitol has been overrun. We've lost all control of the Capitol. It's unprecedented. No one has ever done this before, not since the British burned the Capitol in... Did they burn it in 1812? It was the War of 1812. They may have burned it later. We'll start a war with you with the Capitol to be burned later, was the negotiated deal. But at any rate, no one's done that for quite some time. It's unprecedented. Aha! Consolidation of complete power. Excuse me, this is an announcement that I've lost control of the Capitol. But you said it was unprecedented, and that's what unprecedented means. It's actually not. Okay. Armstrong really trying to prove herself for her fellow Republicans because she wasn't singled out as bad enough by Pelosi, which would have been a badge of honor. She is willing to do anything and everything to maintain control over her conference, which is a caucus, for the next 18 months. Jordan, of course, echoed Armstrong as he walked into McCarthy's office following the speaker's announcement. It is a... It is what? It is blank. What word... After what Armstrong said, should Jim Jordan not be permitted to use, right? Armstrong just said she said when Speaker Pelosi uses the word unprecedented, it's code for her consolidation of power. Jim Jordan strides to the microphone and says, this is unprecedented. But when Jim Jordan uses the word unprecedented, it means I don't like wearing jackets. And that's true. It's objectively true and everyone can see it. So he's a truth teller when he says unprecedented. She's a liar when she says it. It has never happened before, and that part is, I don't know, maybe it is true. Maybe it's probably not, really, honestly. Anyway, we already know what this is. It's a partisan attack against, he says President Trump, and they put in his, quote, some brackets such that it reads, former President Donald Trump, in case you thought we were talking about former President Ivanka Trump. The Ohio Republican, that's Jordan, added that he has to talk to McCarthy, but is unsure whether any of the GOP members that the leader chose would participate in the select panel. I think by now we know they won't. Pelosi has scheduled a meeting of select committee members for midday Thursday. That's today, right after the show. They're waiting to hear what I tell them to do. According to a source briefed on the planning, she had individual conversations with members of her leadership team Tuesday as she weighed what to do, as described by multiple Democrats familiar with the talks, the senior Democrats on the select committee, and two close Pelosi allies, Chair Benny Thompson of Mississippi and Representative Zoe Lofgren of California, were dead set against having Jordan and Banks on the panel. Other senior Democrats were also upset but did not feel as firmly as Thompson and Lofgren, knowing the potential fallout if they did veto McCarthy's choices could be significant. Another Democrat on the panel who asked for anonymity, to speak candidly, said that while they were worried about the potential disruptions the Republicans would cause, particularly Jordan, they were determined to get to work, that's good, and confident that Democrats could leverage their quorum to keep the panel under control. Ultimately, Pelosi deferred to Thompson and Lofgren, seems fair, issuing the statement announcing her decision around lunchtime Wednesday when we were getting the chicken. I can't believe they knew that, and they put that in the Politico article. Bizarre. It's a very popular show. Democrats had steeled themselves for the possibility no Republican appointees would take part in the committee and are still planning to proceed with their panel's first hearing next week. Okay, I'm a little bit late on our music, so we'll exit at an unusual spot on it, but try to keep things lined up right so that you don't miss anything. But note the careful language here that they're using, right? Democrats had steeled themselves. Stop the steal, by the way. Steeled themselves for the possibility that no Republican appointees would take part. Of course, one of the appointees, Cheney, is a Republican, but she wasn't appointed by Republicans.
Hi everyone, it's me, Gil. Minimal contributor to content, but regular contributor to funding for Kagro in the morning. Let's change things up from David's so very tired plea for your contributions with a plea of my own. If you want to add your voice to the show, do it. Record your own segment using your favorite recording device and send it to David. Read an article and give your opinion. Write your own essay and read that. The sky's the limit. Well, not really. Try to keep it relatively short so David doesn't have to stress about cutting it and hurting your feelings. Join the hallowed ranks of Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter and be part of this somewhat witty deep dive into political topics with unnecessary censoring. Lend your voice to the show by sending it to kagrox@gmail.com. KAGROX@gmail.com.
Hi, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, we left off in the middle of the reading of this Politico article about the rejection by Democrats in general and in the person of Nancy Pelosi of two Republicans nominated by Republicans to the January 6th committee. And that makes a difference, you know, how you express all this. And trying to recall exactly what I wanted to highlight when we get over to the Cillizza article, his version of events. And I think, though, it had to do with the fact that they were just, like, the journalists were intentionally forgetting that Cheney was on there. It comes up, and I think even in Cillizza's article he makes mention of it, but it's buried lead. And where we left off here, weren't they stealing themselves for something? That's right. Okay, the Democrats had steeled themselves with the possibility that no Republican appointees would take part in the committee and are still planning to proceed with their panel's first hearing next week. They also noted that the roster is already bipartisan, true, with the appointment of staunch Trump critic Liz Cheney, obviously Republican and from Wyoming, and some Democrats acknowledge that Pelosi could now appoint additional members to those GOP seats. I guess that's true, and I guess I don't know. I mean, I guess you could nominate Democrats if you want. She could pick the Republicans that she wants. That's a possibility, too. I don't know whether she's going to stoke the the fire any more than this, though. Anyhow, this is about the integrity of the investigation, period, Thompson said in a statement. Indeed, a prospective GOP boycott didn't appear to bother one House Democratic leader. That's all right with me, said Whip Jim Clyburn. He told Politico that this was what he told them about their refusal to participate. That was odd. I jumped in the middle of the sentence. But he says it's all right with him. It's okay with me, too. Cheney told reporters that she agreed with Pelosi's actions, adding that at every opportunity the minority leader has attempted to prevent the American people from understanding what happened on January 6th. One of the Republicans Pelosi nixed may be a material witness, Cheney added, referring to Jim Jordan himself. But beyond Cheney, alarm over Pelosi's veto extended to even GOP moderates, though there aren't any, who had called for an independent inquiry into the Capitol siege. Well, tough noogies, dudes, because the GOP moderates who called for an independent inquiry had their call blocked by Republicans, non-moderates, that is to say, the rest of the Republican Party. So the independent inquiry was never on the table because of you and your allies. Now this is the best you can get, so you sabotage this too. Your point of view, not particularly helpful here. Do you want to know what it was and who they consider a moderate for the purposes, solely for the purpose of introducing as evidence the name of the Republican Politico reporters considered to be moderate, and without endorsing his views either on their own or as an expression of any sort of moderate approach to politics, I offer this evidence. Politico says that this person is a moderate, the person who says it is wrong. It's why most of us who supported the bipartisan commission opposed the select committee bill. Pelosi will have her thumb on the scales with this partisan committee, and the findings will already be baked in, said Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska. You've never heard of him, I guess, and that's supposed to mean he's a moderate, because he hasn't been out there saying, actually the insurrection and pedophilia are both good and should be the position of the Republican Party in the United States. And quite frankly, it isn't even a matter for partisan politics. All true patriotic Americans ought to be pedophile insurrectionists. He has not said that. That makes him a moderate. Well, there you have it. Don Bacon, who had strongly advocated for his GOP colleagues to support a bipartisan 9/11 style commission on the insurrection, which Republicans were perfectly capable of sabotaging even when it was the actual 9/11 commission on the attacks then. But at any rate, turning everything like the warnings in the presidential daily briefing into historical documents. It didn't mean anything. No one could have predicted the attack on 9/11, even though I was handed a paper predicting the attack on 9/11. But you see, I thought that was a historical document, or I don't even know what that actually means. I didn't actually think that, but Condoleezza Rice said I should think that, so I do think that, and you can't attack her. My God, if you do that, you're a racist and a misogynist. So I've heard. So, therefore, I don't know. I guess I'm off the hook. Anyway, that's what that's what passes for a moderate in Politico. I supported the bipartisan commission, but it lost. I opposed the committee in the House because the Democrats will turn it into a partisan exercise. I suppose that's an accusation you could make. I don't know that it's necessarily anything I absolutely believe about this, and not just because I'm a Democrat, but also, I guess, partially, I'll say this: I don't believe it because I am a Democrat. Maybe I do disbelieve it because I'm a Democrat, but that makes me believe that Democrats, just because they're Democrats, won't take full advantage of anything, no matter what the situation is. And it's very hard to believe that they would take partisan advantage to their benefit and really fully leverage what's available to them as partisan advantage and use it. Certainly not in the way that Republicans will. That, I guess, brings me also to part of the Twitter exchange this morning. I happened to see Brian Beutler adding to a very long thread that's been going on for a couple of days on this subject. But one tweet in the thread that grabbed my eye was, maybe I do need the one just before it to sort of set the context here, where he says the headline could be, he's complaining about, I don't know whose headline it is, but the basic headlines of, as he says, the papers rather print disinformation like bipartisan probe falls apart than to treat Republican conduct as a series of choices to be questioned. The headline could be Republicans withdraw from insurrection committee, or bipartisan investigation will proceed with Democrats and Cheney. But that would require tackling questions like, why are Republicans behaving in this way, rather than treating their dirty dealing as a constant? The whole genesis of this thread really was that journalists are so used to Republican deception and disingenuousness that they bake it into everything. Like when they do something disingenuous, they don't say Republicans caught being disingenuous. They just say it's another day. Republicans, adopted this stance, and Democrats, scornfully reacted, et cetera, et cetera. But this is just the basic default Republican position, and there's nothing remarkable about it. And so it goes unremarked upon. He then goes on to say, this is the tweet that I jumped at. It's wild because one of the most incredible stories in U.S. history is right there for the plucking. An organized mob of the president's supporters attacked the Capitol, and his party is now trying to cover up the connections between the two. That's, of course, what's going on here. That's why we object to the idea. I say we, it wasn't me, but I support them in this decision. That the idea that Jim Jordan and I guess Jim Banks are all about covering up the connections between one of the major parties in the country and that occupies, I guess, nearly half the seats in the legislature, trying to cover up their connection to the mob, the insurrection, the insurgency that continues in this country, and they're covering it up. That was an interesting thought too, covering it up. Like, they were proud of what they did, but they're busy covering it up, and that's because they lost the insurrection. The battle was fought, and they lost it, and the losers are now trying to cover their tracks. Had they won, had they prevailed and been ready to write the history, as is usually the reward for the winners, ordinarily anyway, throughout history, then every Republican, including Don Bacon, would have been holding up even their most meager contributions as founding acts of patriotism. I might even be on Mount Rushmore because I didn't object to the insurrection, and I merely locked my door and hid under the desk because I wasn't sure what was going on, and I thought they might come to try to kill me because I've been insufficiently cruel to immigrants or something like that, and they might come and kill me for that. I don't know. They might think I support Mike Pence, for Christ's sake. Who knows what they think about me? But I hid under my desk in the most patriotic possible way. They would all be rushing to have supported the insurrection at that point. And people like the Q shaman would be, I stood in my stupid hat with the horns in the well of the Senate for patriotism. I, too, should be carved into a mountain somewhere. But because they lost, they have to engage in this cover-up instead. But I bring that point up just to say, the usual course of things, the winners write the history. We usually point that out as saying, well, that's not entirely fair, and you won't often get the full truth, both sides, if you will, when the winners write the history. But it's sort of been the default rule, often because the losers are dead. It's not that we wouldn't necessarily give them a chance to write a minority report on the history, but we've often killed them in order to secure their status as the losers. And by the way, that's very frequently necessary because if you let them live, they stand there and claim to be the winners, and things get worse. But we've experimented with that in time, at times throughout history. Not always, but we've tried it once or twice. It hasn't worked out particularly well, but I guess people think of us as, an evolved democracy because we don't execute them all the time. Anyway, usually, even without executing them, the opportunity is there for the winners to write the history. But my problem is that the winners here, my worry is that they're Democrats. And for whatever reason, in this instance, as in a few others, the winners are refusing to write the history. In fact, they're refusing to write the history unless they have bipartisan cooperation from the losers. So are we being more inclusive? Are we just trying to write a Howard Zinn type approach to history, making sure that we're including minority voices along the way? Is that admirable? I mean, ordinarily, when it's not a history of an insurrection, it might be a good idea. But there have been times when we've been less than accommodating of the losers. Illustrated the end of the thread, my own reaction thread this morning. Nobody had to negotiate this. Here's a picture of the hanging of the Lincoln assassination co-conspirators. I don't think we offered them a seat on the jury or anything. They may have asked for it. We probably rejected it, and we executed them for their role in the assassination anyway. But, on the other hand, we did the Reconstruction thing and then said, to hell with it, and we'll let the former Confederates have the place back. And they can even put up statues, and we'll leave them there for 100 years. Anyway, I'm a little bitter about it. So I think we've pretty much reached the end of the Pelosi article from Politico. Let me take a look. Yeah, we'll wind it up here. We stopped with reading about Don Bacon. And then, let's see, who were we talking about here? Davis said Pelosi. I forget which Davis we're talking about here. But a quick scan back isn't answering my question either. But let's read on. Davis said Pelosi had brought up the idea of a bipartisan panel to him when the House had reconvened after the tumult of January 6th, calling it disappointing that she had chosen to veto Republican members. Okay. Pelosi's move followed a statement by Banks upon his selection by McCarthy as the lead GOP member of the January 6th investigation, in which the chair of the Republican Study Committee, that's Banks, that's my one of our contested pronunciation words, lambasted. Which one do you like? I think I prefer basted because it makes me think of basting lamb. It's delicious sounding, lambasted. But anyway, the speaker's motives for creating the select panel on the Capitol insurrection. So again, criticizing the speaker's motives for creating the select panel. The motive for selecting anything was to, have an investigation of what actually happened here and presumably blame the right people, even though Democrats just tend not to bother doing that in the end. But we wanted to do it in a different setting, outside of Congress, more evenly divided, etc., but you wouldn't have any of it. So the motives for creating the select panel are because otherwise the option is to do nothing, and that's unacceptable. But what is their version of it? Make no mistake, Nancy Pelosi created this committee solely to malign conservatives and to justify the left's authoritarian agenda. Projector Jim Banks said in his statement. That comment caused outrage among Democrats over potentially naming Banks to the investigative panel, according to a senior party aide familiar with caucus deliberations. Good. I'm glad I read on because that reminds me what I wanted to pull out of the Saliza piece. In addition, Jordan sparked concern among allies of the speaker for his communications with former President Donald Trump to discuss Trump's bid to challenge Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election. McCarthy himself is at the center of another contentious Trump-related moment, a phone call that he had with the former president during the riot. The GOP leader had previously suggested he would be willing to testify before the panel about that conversation, but dodged that question on Wednesday. My phone call's out there, McCarthy told reporters, adding that it doesn't get to the answer of why we were ill-prepared for the riot. No, it doesn't, and it was never intended to go to that question, and it's stupid to hold the two of them up side by side. But yes, he's frightened about the prospect of being asked about this thing. Eventually, if he were called to testify, he'd balk. If he were somehow forced to testify, whether legally or politically, he'll simply get up and give nonsensical, non sequitur answers to these things and walk away hoping for the best. Anyway, so like I said, we've reached the end here. There was this reminder in here about what Salissa was talking about. Where was this? Make no mistake, why she created the thing. Right? No. Now, this is the part where it came up. Make no mistake, Nancy Pelosi created this committee solely to malign conservatives and to justify the left's authoritarian agenda, which I thought was very interesting as projection goes. Okay. Well, let me jump over to the solicitor. This just goes to prove that I need to interrupt myself, and there's no way for me to preserve these thoughts in my head when I'm reading aloud. So here, the offending Chris Salissa piece, just one of several out there under stupid headlines like Nancy Pelosi just doomed the already tiny chances of the 1-6 committee actually mattering. If you ever held any hope, he begins, that the House Select Committee on January 6th U.S. Capitol, on the January 6th U.S. Capitol riot, there we are, might produce a report that would help us understand what happened in the lead up to that day, and in so doing provide us avenues to keeping it from happening again, you should give up on those hopes now. The reason, Speaker Nancy Pelosi's decision on Wednesday to reject 2 of the 5 nominees, Jordan and Banks, put forward by House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to serve on the panel. The unprecedented nature, remember this, of January 6th demands this unprecedented decision, which we were told means that she's an authoritarian and she's looking to have absolute power because she used the word unprecedented. The Speaker's office pointed to a statement on Monday, now I remember, in which she had said, ready, that any past votes would not be a criterion for exclusion from the Select Committee. Now, Salissa goes on, I guess, to accuse her of hypocrisy or backtracking on this. Again, past votes won't be a criterion for exclusion from the Select Committee. And yet, Banks and Jordan both voted, for instance, not to accept the results of the Electoral College, to challenge the Electoral College votes and counting those votes from certain states. Therefore, they obviously couldn't be included on the committee. Now, that might in fact be reason enough to exclude them from the committee, but that was not among the criteria announced by the Speaker. There were others, and believe it or not, sometimes they overlapped, that would be used. But she says past votes won't do it. And in fact, there is, what's his name? Troy Nels, who voted to object to the Electoral College count and nonetheless was deemed acceptable, at least to Pelosi and the Democrats in the House, for inclusion on this committee. So, I mean, I think that you would think that would tend to close the case on it. He voted in this same way and yet was acceptable on the committee. That ordinarily, using ordinary logic, must mean that at least that vote would not be used as a litmus test because he failed that litmus test and yet he was accepted in his nomination to the committee. That would seem to close the case, but not for Chris Salissa, right? So, Speaker's office pointed to a statement on Monday in which she said any past votes would not be a criterion. However, in her statement on Wednesday announcing her decision to keep Jordan and Banks off the committee, she cited, what did she cite? This must mean that he sees her saying she cited his votes, their votes against the Electoral College, right? No, she cited concern about statements made and actions taken by these members, which would seem to suggest that their past views on January 6th, including past votes, even though she just explicitly said it would not include past votes, but he feels that it would because they did vote that way and now they're off, even though there's a counterexample right in front of his face. He just feels like he can go ahead and say that, including past votes, which she just said it would not. like when they both objected to the Electoral College votes in Pennsylvania and Arizona, very much played a role. Except that she says that they didn't, and there's evidence that they couldn't have played a major role given that this Troy Nehls guy had been accepted anyway. A third appointee, as he then notes, representative from Texas, Troy Nehls, also voted to object, but Pelosi said she would be fine with him on the committee, perhaps, didn't ask, but perhaps because of Nehls' background as a sheriff prior to coming to Congress. Oh, yes, I am sure that she said, now wait a minute here. I said that past votes wouldn't be taken into consideration, but I would like to change my mind and take those votes into consideration after all. That's it. Banks, you're out of here. Jordan, out of here. Nehls, Niedermeyer. Right, Nehls, you're out of here. You voted for... Wait a minute. Why didn't anybody tell me he was a sheriff at one point in his career? That changes everything. I was going to say, if he had been a wrestling coach, I'd reconsider. But then again, I don't know. Jordan, he's just a clown. So, all right. No more exemptions for wrestling coaches. That hasn't worked out with Hastert. Hasn't worked out with Jordan. Just never mind. Somebody write that down. Please, no automatic passes for past wrestling coaches anymore. I'm tired of doing that. And now I would like to say that the same applies to sheriffs. There's no chance that she ever said, well, I was a sheriff prior to coming to Congress. Where did he get that from? I mean, I'm sure he was a sheriff. I don't know where he got that part from. But where did she get it? Where does Celissa get the only reason that's in there is to justify his taking her statement on its face and throwing it out. She says no votes are going to be taken into consideration. There's plenty of other things people do besides voting. I'm excluding Banks and Jordan based on their past comments and actions, not the votes. If you don't believe me, look at Nehls. He voted the same way that they voted on what should be the key vote, and I'm still taking him. So, doesn't that prove the case? No, because he was a sheriff. What? I mean, I don't know why they don't just kick him down the stairs over at CNN, but they don't. They're wonderful people. They're like the rest of our American exceptionals. We don't hang our traitors, and they don't kick Celissa down the stairs. No matter Pelosi's reasoning, and it doesn't matter because I'm going to write this article regardless of what her reasoning is, her decision to reject Jordan and Banks, the two most high-profile Republicans put forward by McCarthy, and I guess that's true. Jordan certainly is. Banks is unknown, but if the question is, well, what are the two most high-profile Republicans? Well, it's Jim Jordan and whoever McCarthy said was going to be chairman. I guess that would be the automatic answer. So anyway, her rejection of them dooms even the possibility of the committee being perceived as bipartisan or its eventual findings being seen as independent, which they never were going to be seen that way. That's why they tried to establish an independent commission, but Republicans crapped on that, and the only alternative available was to do something inside of Congress, which, no matter what happens, if it's a congressional panel, there's going to be a majority on it, a clear majority and a clear minority, and they're tied to party affiliation. There was no way to avoid the accusation of partisanship. Pelosi and her Democratic defenders will cast the decision as the only one she really had available to her after McCarthy made his picks known earlier this week, and it's beyond debate that McCarthy's choices, he does acknowledge this, especially Banks and Jordan, were aimed at turning the committee into something of a circus, by which we mean the friggin' Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey circus of all time. Trademark. Both men would have, at every turn, sought to turn is what it says, the tables on Democrats using the platform provided by the committee to push debunked claims about Antifa's involvement in the Capitol riot, questioning Democratic leadership's readiness for just such an attack, and trying to broaden the committee's mandate to cover the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, which would have nothing to do with anything, but they would very much like to deflect to them. Knowing this, Pelosi's move is rightly understood as robbing Republicans of that platform, to which they were never entitled, we should add. But it also dooms the committee, before it even holds a single hearing or meeting. Because, predictably, in the immediate aftermath of Pelosi's announcement, McCarthy said he was pulling all 5 of his nominees to the committee, unless Speaker Pelosi reverses course and seats all 5 Republican nominees, even though there are 6. We only made 5 of them. Why wouldn't you do your job? Republicans will not be party to their sham process. You all heard that statement in the other article. You can be sure every Republican will use Pelosi's rejection of their nominees as evidence that she doesn't want the truth to come out. I don't know why the inclusion of truth versus, say, putting truth in scare quotes, or I don't know what he was trying to get at there. This isn't true, of course. There's zero evidence that suggests Pelosi or Democrats did anything wrong in advance of or during the January 6th riot, he helpfully states in the last paragraph of the piece, which was incited by former President Donald Trump. But Pelosi has handed the Republicans a golden issue to rev up their base in advance of the 2022 midterms, and you can bet they will use it. That's at least a decent observation. It's true. And that's it. That's where the story ends. Only at the end does he say, oh, by the way, it actually is true that, the accusation that they're making about Pelosi and Democrats in general is totally untrue. There's nothing but a mountain of evidence in favor of their having been responsible and having encouraged the event. But nonetheless, that's the accusation that'll be made, and I will announce right now that it's going to succeed. My headline eventually when they make their attack is, attack succeeds, because I've decided ahead of time that it would and should. So I think that's it. An hour on this topic, probably enough. We'll possibly move on from here. If I hadn't done it, Greg would have, so don't blame me. Blame Nancy Pelosi, I guess. We can do that. We'll be back in just 1 minute. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Yeah, I think I'd have to agree. Mad Hatter had tweeted in the middle of this, of course, that Cillizza is a complete idiot, and gosh, it feels like that's actually the case. So there you have it. I guess we'll exit from this topic for now, unless I find out that I accidentally had more in the pocket about this that was important than I thought. With this NYC Southpaw tweet, just noting for the record, just want to remind people again that Democrats negotiated for a bipartisan 1-6 commission, acceding to all the Republicans' demands in the bill, and the Republicans sabotaged the deal anyway. McConnell put his personal relationship with Republican senators at stake to, and this is an unusual addition to the tweets of Southpaw, to effing kill that bill. So I don't think anybody needed reminding of it, but I thought that was a good capper from things. Plus, we get to know for the record, Southpaw cursed. We all saw it. Anyway, let's see. Other items of note to catch up on. I won't bother reading the Hill's report on House erupts in anger over January 6th and Trump's role. I think we all know what that's about. We probably won't gain any more insight by reading anything from the Hill at this point. Let's see. Oh, this is the original CNN piece on Pelosi's rejection of Banks and Jordan. Important mostly for the fact that it includes a picture of Banks. It's the first time I've seen anybody bother to do that. Let's see. Of note in other areas of particular interest to the show, New York Times reporting in the person of Carl Hulse that more than 30 former top Senate Democratic aides have called for changes to the filibuster rules, I guess in a joint letter to I don't know who, but we'll find out if we actually read the piece. I am curious about who was involved, and I don't think I see anywhere the names of all of those involved. I was curious because I had this inkling that among the 30, probably not all of the 30, but among the 30, you would probably find the names of some people who were among our staunchest opponents in our initial say, 2010 era efforts to lobby senators and their top aides about the necessity of changing filibuster rules and the mechanics of how it might be done. But then eventually having won that fight and having seen them use the much more aggressive version of the procedure we described in 2013, they had by that time climbed on board, and now they are advocates of reforming the filibuster, and we're glad, so people come around. But this is one of those insidery kind of things that people like me who participated in the first round of this thing say to ourselves and to our audiences to sound really cool, like we were for filibuster reform before it was cool, even though so many other people were probably way, way ahead of me. They just didn't have blogs to use to make their point. At any rate, let's see what's put forth here. Hoping to build momentum for a change in Senate filibuster rules, more than 30 former chiefs of staff to Democratic senators have written an open letter calling for repeal or reform of the procedural tactic they say no longer serves its original purpose. The 31 signers of the letter, one for each flavor at Baskin-Robbins, I believe, was the basis for that choice, who worked for more than 25 current and former Democratic lawmakers, conceded that they and their former bosses had embraced the filibuster in the past. Okay, so they have made that concession. I would add to that they needn't concede it because nobody knew that this was the case, but they should, for my purposes, concede that many of them probably insisted that I not be given a meeting with anyone in their office, or that if I did get the meeting, once I helped put together a coalition of lobbyists that were important to them and to whom they responded habitually because they were close allies, and who realized that the filibuster stood in the way of their ability to get any part of their agenda done. That was the whole point of putting together this coalition of people. The argument, of course, at the time being, it doesn't matter what your agenda is. If you also support some of these other things, whatever your agenda is, it's not going anywhere so long as the filibuster stands in the way. And any other items that you might think are important, whether it be climate change, unemployment benefits extension, saving Social Security from a Republican acts, what have you. It doesn't matter what your choice might be. Now, these days, voting rights, none of that was going to happen so long as the Republicans could, without lifting a finger, prevent any of it from happening. And you should come together and realize that. And what we were hoping to do, the whole strategy was, sure, they're not going to listen to the idiot blogger who is here to explain this thing, even though what he's explaining was written and published in the Harvard Journal of whatever the hell it was. And it's a Harvard Journal, for Christ's sake. Harvard Journal of Law, and I don't remember. Anyway, we can look it up. That's the Golden Gupta article that I've discussed extensively in the past. Wasn't my idea. Wasn't even their idea. It's really just a matter of reading the Senate history and precedents, the history of the filibuster reform fights from the 1950s through the 1970s. Nothing more than distilling that, and then adding the added observation that, look, your agenda just will never succeed. It doesn't matter how popular or sensible it is. So anyway, the idea was, for instance, that we would get, okay, so you have senators who regularly deal with some of the coalition members. I mean, one of the top names of the coalition that we were able to help put together was Communications Workers of America, big union. So for Democratic senators for whom relationships with unions like CWA and others were important because they're repeat players in so much legislation, and they, the lobbyists know the members and know the senators and know the top staffers. And if you could get them to say, no, this actually makes sense. It's not just a dumbass blogger thing. This is for real. We agree with this. Oh, you agree. Well then, let's take a look at the fundamental function of the world's greatest deliberative body. After all, I knew that going in. Basically, I helped build a coalition because I knew that I would be viewed very stupidly as perhaps a stupid person. Why should I believe this incredible thing? I've always heard that you can't change the filibuster rules without a 2/3 vote, and now some idiot is telling me otherwise. Well, that's true. An idiot is telling you that, but I'm here to tell you, I'm not an idiot, and I checked it out, and it's true. And we've gotten the agreement of the idiot to allow you to say it wasn't the idiot who told me, it was the communications workers, because the idiot says I'd rather just succeed than have you say I'm not an idiot. Okay. That didn't matter as much to me. So that worked. That was the strategy. And you could try it too. It's one of those things that sometimes works. Anyway, the 31 signers of the letter, who work for more than 25 current and former Democratic lawmakers, conceded that they had embraced the filibuster in the past. But they argued that the maneuver is now being abused as a blunt force instrument to stall most legislation. And at that time, in 2010, all the nominations as well. Over the course of the past 20 years, the filibuster has put a chokehold on the Senate, said the letter, to be published on the website of the anti-filibuster group Fix Our Senate. Aha, so we've spoken with them before, right? Eli Zupnik. The legislation, or all legislation really, is now routinely filibustered, transforming the Senate from a place of meaningful debate and progress into a legislative graveyard. By the way, I guess we should say high praise then for Fix Our Senate, who has evolved the process to the point where the former, or some of the former opponents of my approach and the coalition approach have been brought on board as an even more powerful part of the new coalition that is having even greater success convincing even more Democrats that even more reform is necessary. So kudos to them for that. The letter also said that the main arguments typically cited for maintaining the filibuster, that it fosters bipartisanship, protects minority rights and prevents wild swings in policy with changes in power, also and I say because they no longer hold true. That's exactly what they've said, minus the part. I would have been terrible at drafting this letter. The filibuster, once used sparingly, was never intended to be a way for the minority to routinely block legislation by preventing bills from advancing, they wrote. Many of us stood shoulder to shoulder with our former bosses when they filibustered legislation, and it was a valuable tool, said Eric Mogilnicki. I have no idea how you would pronounce it. Mogil, Nicki. Mogilnicki. If you know him, apologize to him for me. He's was chief of staff to former Senators Ted Kennedy and Paul Kirk, his successor, in Massachusetts. But it shouldn't be that overwhelming the filibuster is the only way to pass legislation. Mr. McGilligorilla here, what's his name? Mogilnicki. I got no idea where that emphasis would fall. Organized the letter along with Dre Samuelson, once the top aide to former Senator Tim Johnson of South Dakota. I bet Ellie knows how to pronounce his name because he probably worked with him to put the letter together. The former aides banded together on the issue after Senate Republicans in recent weeks blocked several top Democratic priorities through a filibuster, including a sweeping voting rights bill as well as bipartisan legislation to establish the Independent Commission to investigate the January 6th assault on the Capitol by supporters of Donald J. Trump. Like many Democratic senators who have backed the filibuster in the past, the aides said their views had evolved as the tool was increasingly employed to thwart critically needed legislation supported by a majority of senators. They concluded that eliminating or weakening the filibuster could lead to enacting laws they oppose. They understand that. We understood it. We said as much even back then and said, the Senate might have to bend to the will of the majority of voters in this country, even though it's not designed to do that. Because, we've been over that for a long time. The rural and Republican, therefore, chokehold on the Senate, a huge problem, illustrating the imbalance in voting power in the legislatures between centers of population and states. Ready for some fancy talk? States qua states. Yes. So let's see. That's interesting. That's essentially also an embodiment of our coalition approach. Their views evolved as the tool was increasingly employed, or it was increasingly demonstrated to them anyway, that it would thwart critically needed legislation supported by a majority of senators. Just what we said in putting our coalition together. Doesn't matter what your issue is, it will die a death. That's what you die. When you die, it's a death. You'll die a death in the Senate, no matter what your issue is, because there's always going to be at least one Republican who feels like, what the hell, let's stop it. And once the strategy becomes any Democratic legislation that passes the Senate is a victory for Democrats, and they'll use that to run in the next election, and we want them to lose in the next election. Obviously, there was no other choice. But for Republican strategy, when in the minority, to be filibuster everything that the Democrats want to do. We're looking to take over here in the next election, and if we let them have victories and declare them, our chances of winning back the majority are that much more diminished. So piecemeal, we'll do these things. So now these views have evolved because they had to, because we told them what would happen, and then they realized that it was happening. And I guess their evolution never really required them to say, you were right. It really only required them to say, I'm right for realizing this thing that they predicted would happen is happening. But never mind they're predicting it. The point is I now observe it and I will move forward. And again, we knew that going in. And that's just basic psychology, right? You need to be able to find a way for people to come to the realization that you're right on their own and think it was their idea. I mean, you want to be a successful lobbyist, or do you want to be famous for something, right? Famous for losing. My name's all over the paper, but I lost. My name's nowhere in the paper, but we won. That's what we're after. We know that repealing or reforming the filibuster, the letter continues, the filibuster rule, will someday lead to policy outcomes that we deeply dislike. And that might have been blocked under current Senate rules, the letter states, but we believe in a Senate where the people's business can be done. That doesn't mean like insurrection style, where that one guy came in and did his business and then smeared it on the walls. They mean the regular stuff. While support has grown among Democratic senators for abolishing the 60-vote threshold for advancing legislation, filibuster opponents in the party currently lack the minimum 50 votes that would be required to overturn the rule. You know why, and you know who. No further mention, that's the end of the article, no further mention of the names of the 30-some former aides, and no link anywhere to the letter either. So we can never be entirely sure, but quite honestly, I don't know if I remember all the names anyhow. But anyhow, that was an interesting article and a good reminder of what it took to get us to this point. And let's see, speaking of the things at stake, so long as the filibuster continues to be an obstacle, they mentioned the voting rights legislation, which has suffered a loss along the way as a result. I thought this was an interesting looking piece. Is it huge and long? Probably is, because most Ian Millhiser pieces are. Plus, on top of that, he writes for Vox now, and they love enormously long and complicated pieces. But this seemed like an interesting one to read through anyway, and we've got a little time available to us. How America Lost Its Commitment to the Right to Vote. That I thought was an interesting area of inquiry. How did it come to be the case that, one entire major political party who stand for election all the time and stand on claims of patriotism and truth, justice, and the American way, yada, yada, could in fact endorse the position that to hell with it, we don't really actually want everybody to vote. It's pretty easy from a Gimmitarian perspective. A Gimmitarian analysis will tell you, because it's good for them. What they want is for their supporters to be allowed to vote and for the supporters of the other party not to be able to vote. And they've found some interesting ways, just as where our the efforts of our analysts have gone into developing formulas like, did you know that people who drive Subarus are that much more likely to be Democratic voters? It's almost 100% predictor of their political affiliation. For some reason, I don't know what statistic, what percentage they really put in it, but that's a real thing. Like, they've actually developed that, and it's observable, and I'm sure it actually holds true. But our analysts are busy working on, well, what proxy can we use that's harmless? Well, why don't we send mailers, fundraising solicitations to everybody who's bought a Subaru? If we buy the list from the local Subaru dealer, that's what we're working on. On the Republican side, they're like, well, let's see, how about this? The average housing unit price in these areas is below the median, and poverty being what it is in affecting minority populations disproportionately, right? And minority populations being disproportionately likely to support Democrats. Why don't we look for publicly available information about housing prices and look to, target people that way? Wherever housing prices are low, we'll pressure our people on the local elections board to vote to redistribute voting machines in the precincts where the housing price, the average housing price is much higher. We're not instructing them. Please don't write down anywhere. Please put the voting machines where the white people are and the black people aren't, because that would get us in trouble, or used to get us in trouble with the Justice Department before we dismantled that and threw out the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, et cetera. But back in the olden days, they said, please be sure to craft it such that look, it's about housing prices. That's not about race. We didn't mention black or white or anything in this whole thing. And it was only until we began to see through that they began to, I guess they ended up abandoning it. And then they changed the composition of the Supreme Court and the basic credo of the Republican Party such that it didn't matter about being careful anymore. So anyway, how did we come to this point where there's a major political party that no longer is interested in even mouthing fealty to Americans' rights to vote? Well, I guess he puts it in the courts, because the Supreme Court, shows up in the subheader here, isn't even pretending that it's bound by legal texts in its voting rights cases. Let's get to it or we'll run out of time again. The Supreme Court, Justice Elena Kagan, lamented in a dissenting opinion earlier this month, has treated no statute worse than the Voting Rights Act. That actually was very Trumpian in its composition. No thing has been treated worse than the Voting Rights Act. But she's right, says Ian. The Voting Rights Act is arguably the most successful civil rights law in American history. Originally signed in 1965, it was the United States' first serious attempt since Reconstruction, which sucked, to build, to build a multiracial democracy, and it worked. Actually, Reconstruction itself worked pretty good. It was our abandonment of it that did not. Just 2 years after President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, black voter registration rates in the Jim Crow stronghold of Mississippi, now a COVID stronghold, skyrocketed from 6.7% to nearly 60%. Much better. Still not there, but you get the idea. And yet, in a trio of cases, Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, Abbott versus Perez in 2018, and Bronovich, the one that just recently was decided, Bronovich versus DNC this year, the court drained nearly all of the life out of this landmark statute. After Bronovich, the decision that inspired Kagan's statement that the court has treated the Voting Rights Act worse than any other federal law, it's unclear whether the Supreme Court would rule in favor of voting rights plaintiffs even if a state legislature tried outright to rig an election. Which, I don't know how much more outright it can get. But they still try to look for other reasons to, cover-ups reasons for the things they do to rig an election. These cases are the culmination of more than half a century of efforts by conservatives who, after failing to convince elected lawmakers to weaken voting rights, embarrassing, right? Nobody wants to be connected to that. They turned to an unelected judiciary to enact a policy that would never have made it through Congress, although now it might, because it's next year, too. It could be half QAnon. All of this is bad news for minority voters in America, who are most likely to be disadvantaged by many of the new restrictions currently being pushed in state houses across America, and for the country's relatively young commitment to multiracial democracy. And there are at least 3 reasons to fear that decisions like Shelby County and Brnovich foreshadow even more aggressive attacks on the right to vote. The first is that Republican partisans can use race as a proxy to identify communities with large numbers of Democratic voters. In 2020, according to the Pew Research Center, 92% of non-Hispanic black voters supported Democrat Joe Biden over Republican Donald Trump, and that's after Trump slightly improved his performance among African Americans compared to 2016. Still 92%, right? That means that state lawmakers who wish to prevent Democrats from voting can do so through policies that make it harder for black voters and, to a lesser extent, most other non-white voters to cast a ballot. And Republican lawmakers haven't been shy about doing so. As a federal appeals court wrote in 2016 about a North Carolina law that included many provisions making it harder to vote, quote, "The new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision." You remember that? An even starker example than, and remember, we're talking about even starker example than surgical precision. Georgia recently enacted a law that effectively enables the state Republican Party to disqualify voters and shut down polling precincts. If the state GOP wields this law to close down most of the polling places in highly Democratic majority black cities of Atlanta, for instance, it's unclear that a Voting Rights Act that's been gravely wounded by 3 Supreme Court decisions remains vibrant enough to block them. Like, you would think, well, okay, if they just outright say, all right, any place black people vote is now closed, right? It's not entirely clear in Millhiser's view that the Voting Rights Act and what remains of it ends up being robust enough to support a decision striking that down. You might be able to pull something from somewhere else, but the VRA has been decimated, and this is the problem with it. The second reason to be concerned about decisions like Brnovich is that the Supreme Court's attacks on the Voting Rights Act are not isolated. They are part of a greater web of decisions making it much harder for voting rights plaintiffs to prevail in court. These cases include decisions like Purcell v. Gonzalez, 2006, which announced that judges should be very reluctant to block unlawful state voting rules close to an election. We've heard about this one. Crawford versus the Marion County Election Board of 2008, which permitted states to enact voting restrictions that target largely imaginary problems. Like, you would think that, maybe wouldn't be a good basis for law. And Rucho, I'm not sure, R-U-C-H-O versus Common Cause, a 2019 case, which forbade federal courts from hearing partisan gerrymandering lawsuits because the court's Republican-appointed majority deemed such cases too difficult to adjudicate. Well, we can't listen to that because it's very difficult, so we definitely can't hear that case. Sorry, can't even talk about it. Finally, decisions like Shelby County and Brnovich are troubling because the court's reasoning in those opinions appears completely divorced from the actual text of the Constitution and from the text of federal laws such as the Voting Rights Act. Shelby County eliminated the Voting Rights Act's requirements that states with a history of racist election practices pre-clear any new voting rules with officials in Washington, D.C. It was rooted in what Chief Justice John Roberts described as the principle that all states enjoy equal sovereignty, a principle that is never mentioned once in the Constitution, but I guess I understand why people might assume that it's mentioned. but it isn't. We'll try and fit in just one more before we cut out for a break here. One more paragraph here. In Brnovich, the court upheld 2 Arizona laws that disenfranchise voters who vote in the wrong precinct and limit who can deliver an absentee ballot to a polling place. Alito purports to take, quote, a fresh look at the statutory text in this case, but he imposes new limits on the Voting Rights Act, such as a strong presumption that voting restrictions that were in place in 1982 are lawful, or a similar presumption favoring state laws purporting to prevent voter fraud, which have no basis whatsoever in the law's text. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just where we were when we left, right? Same radio station, still here. We're like, I don't know, a quarter of the way through what looks like the scroll of the screening on this piece, but there's lots of big pictures in it, so we'll continue on. Besides, it's a big picture article, so that's good news. That must be what it was. I always thought it was describing the big picture of the situation out there, but it really describes articles that have big pictures in them. They look like they're long, lengthy, and therefore highly intellectual looks at the situation. But in fact, most of the real estate is taken up with pictures, and really, shouldn't everything be like that? Where were we here? We had just read about Brnovich and Alito's, Alito's approach to his decision there, having no basis whatsoever in the text of the Voting Rights Act. As Kagan writes in dissent, Brnovich mostly inhabits a law-free zone. All right, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that this Supreme Court will allow any restriction on voting to stand. Under the most optimistic reading of cases like Brnovich, the court might still intervene if Georgia tries to close down most of the polling places in Atlanta, for instance, but it does mean that voting rights lawyers and their clients can no longer expect to win their cases simply because Congress passed a law protecting their right to vote. They'll just interpret it differently. The rules in American elections are now what Roberts and his 5 even more conservative colleagues say they are, not what the Constitution or any act of Congress has to say about voting rights, which Armando has been telling you since forever, of course. And we've always suspected was the case, but now I guess they're just now becoming emboldened enough to actually act on it. Next section here, how Republicans learned to stop worrying and oppose the Voting Rights Act. In retrospect, it was probably inevitable that the conservative backlash against voting rights would flourish in the one unelected branch of the federal government. When Congress first enacted the Voting Rights Act in 1965, its pre-clearance provision, the provision that was deactivated in Shelby County, was set to expire in 5 years. Congress extended pre-clearance 4 times, in 1970, 1975, 1982, and 2006. And each time the bill reauthorizing the fully operational Voting Rights Act was signed by a Republican president. That's interesting in its own right. And actually went to some of the issues with not only the filibuster, but a number of other general, long-standing, good governance issues that I brought up in the past. The Republicans have been very adept at winning the presidency for themselves, or capturing the presidency anyway, even if they can't actually win it outright. So much so that there were Republicans in place each of the 4 times the voting rights pre-clearance provisions were extended in 1970, 75, 82, and 2006. Every single one a Republican president. Basically, they had dominated the 40 years from Nixon through, at that point, George W. Bush. Republicans had been, in the presidency, I think, 3/4 of that entire time. This despite the fact that, everybody saw what Republicans did with the presidency during Nixon's administration. And still, the backlash to the whole Watergate episode was one term for a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, who was then maligned as, a horrible president, and who, meanwhile, turns out to have been the most decent person we've had in the office since ever. Anyway, at least some of these Republican presidents who signed the legislation renewing the preclearance provisions made aborted efforts at some point to weaken the law, the only kind of abortion they believe in. President Richard Nixon, for example, proposed allowing preclearance to expire in 1970, but he backed down in the face of intense opposition from civil rights organizations. So, by the way, so just in case you were wondering, the law is signed in 1965. By 1970, Republicans are like, well, racism's over now. So it shouldn't be any. The only surprise should be that it took them all the way till Shelby to finally reach that conclusion and be able to do something about it. Similarly, a significant faction within the Reagan administration, a faction that included future Chief Justice Roberts, pressed President Ronald Reagan to veto the 1982 bill expanding the Voting Rights Act. In 1980, Reagan had denounced the Voting Rights Act as humiliating to the South, so that this conservative faction appeared to have a sympathizer in the Oval Office. But Republicans in Congress and in the White House ultimately concluded that standing athwart the Voting Rights Act was too politically toxic. As then Representative Trent Lott of Mississippi warned Reagan in 1981, after an expansive voting rights renewal had already passed the House, anyone who seeks to change that bill will risk being branded as a racist. And they were racist. It would have been good branding, but they didn't want to be branded that way, or they didn't want to risk being branded that way. So we all just simply said, well, they didn't do it. We all know in our hearts they're racists, but we won't take out the brand and heat it up in the fire just now. We'll spare them, because now we're working together in bipartisan fashion, and it's now the Washington consensus that voting rights should survive and the preclearance makes sense, when they were really just waiting for us to forget where we put the brand. By the time the Voting Rights Act was up for reauthorization again in 2006, its conservative opponents had largely given up on convincing elected officials to let much of the law die. The bill passed both houses by overwhelming margins and was signed by President George W. Bush. Republicans don't want to be, again, branded as hostile to minorities, especially just months from an election. Anti-civil rights activist Edward Blum complained in a bitter 2006 article published by National Review, of course. Blum would go on to be the driving force behind Shelby County and other lawsuits seeking to diminish the rights of people of color. Yet, as it turned out, Blum understood something that the conservative opponents of voting rights who lobbied elected officials in vain did not. The premise of an independent judiciary is that judges must be insulated from political pressure so that they will apply the law without favor. This is why federal judges serve for life, and why they are guaranteed to keep their salary as long as they remain in office. But these very same protections also allow judges who support an unpopular policy agenda to implement it without fear of losing their job. By the time Shelby County reached the Supreme Court, the court was dominated by conservatives who, in Justice Antonin Scalia's words, saw the Voting Rights Act as a perpetuation of racial entitlement. Yeah, that's what the civil rights movement was about. They wanted to be first-class citizens and make white people to second class. You see, everyone understood that, right? Whenever a society adopts racial entitlements, Scalia complained during the Shelby County oral arguments, it is very difficult to get out of them through the normal political processes. He then channeled the resentments of men like Blum. I don't think there is anything to be gained by any senator to vote against continuation of this act, Scalia continued, and I am fairly confident that it will be reenacted in perpetuity unless a court can say it does not comport with the Constitution. And so the court said just that. That was their only way out, right? Next section, the Supreme Court's treatment of the Voting Rights Act has no apparent basis in the Constitution or the act itself. We'll get to this part. Now, I guess. Of the many frustrating things about the Shelby County opinion, there is that it doesn't even attempt to root its holdings in the text of the Constitution. The question of what constraints the Constitution's text places on judges, especially when that text is ambiguous, is one of the most hotly contested questions in American law. But even when the court hands down constitutional decisions that are broadly criticized, it typically makes at least some effort to ground its holding in a specific provision of the Constitution. The court's anti-worker decision in Lochner versus New York back in 1905, and its pro-abortion rights decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973, both are examples of cases rooted in the 14th Amendment's promise that no one shall be denied liberty without due process of law. Indeed, even the court's decision in Griswold versus Connecticut, 1965, one of the most widely mocked majority opinions of the past century, that case at least tried to ground its holding in specific constitutional provisions. Griswold established married couples' right to use contraceptives and announced a right to privacy, which scholars and others who've poked around in the Constitution will note doesn't actually appear in the text, but announced a right to privacy that formed the basis for subsequent liberal victories on abortion and sexuality. But the court swiftly abandoned Griswold's legal reasoning, which was rooted in the idea that the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments have, and this was the part that killed him, penumbras. Look it up. Formed by emanations from those guarantees that help give them life and substance. Yes, the right to privacy is never mentioned, but together the first parts of the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments, and that's a lot of amendments, appear to argue that there really should be some explicit statement that is apparently missing for whatever reason of the existence of a right to privacy. The penumbras, taken together, the things that they protect and the ways in which they protect them lead you to conclude that there really ought to just be a blanket right to privacy. And yet, compared to Roberts' majority opinion for Shelby County, Griswold seems like a pan to textualism and judicial restraint. Okay. Shelby County never identifies which provision of the Constitution embodies the, quote, fundamental principle of equal sovereignty among the states, and that the court's decision rests upon. Although Shelby County does make a vague statement that the 15th Amendment is not designed to punish for the past, its purpose is to ensure a better future, this principle appears nowhere in the text of that amendment. And again, we're talking about the 15th Amendment, one of the post-Civil War amendments that only got through after the conclusion of the war and the realization that, okay, now we would be united as a country under the principle that having chattel slavery of any kind, but certainly based on race, was, I think we're going to just agree that this is a bad idea and disallow it at this point. And then we would try and usher in an era of civil rights for all. It took a while to get anywhere close to that, and still not there, but okay. In any event, the concept of equal sovereignty does not flow from Roberts' future-driven interpretation of that amendment. It can't even be found in the 15th Amendment's penumbras and emanations. We don't have to imagine what Shelby County might have said if the court had attempted to ground its decision in constitutional text. And in nearly 200 years of precedent governing how courts should read that text, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that opinion for the court in South Carolina versus Katzenbach back in 1966, the court's original decision upholding the Voting Rights Act, which relies heavily on both the text of the 15th Amendment, and a centuries-old line of cases holding that Congress's power to legislate should be construed broadly. The 15th Amendment has two provisions. The first prohibits the government from denying or abridging the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, while the second clause declares that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Thus, as Warren explained, Congress has broad authority to enact laws preventing race discrimination in voting. That's why they lost so flatly when they sued. Warren quoted a line of cases stretching back to the early days of the Republic, which established that Congress's power to regulate is quite broad indeed. When the Constitution gives Congress the power to legislate on a particular subject matter, the court established in McCulloch versus Maryland, again, way back in 1819, that it may use all means which are appropriate and that are plainly adapted to a legitimate end, so long as Congress does not violate some other provision of the Constitution in the process. Taken together, penumbras, decisions like McCulloch and the 15th Amendment's text yield a clear result. Congress, not the court, gets to decide how it wants to fight race discrimination in voting. Congress, not a handful of Republican-appointed judges, gets to decide whether preclearance should exist and which states should be subject to it. You could, for instance, fight a war to decide that and win it, and still end up losing control of it somehow. Indeed, Congress would have the power to impose a preclearance regime on most state elections rules, even if the 15th Amendment didn't exist. Although the Constitution's Elections Clause permits states to determine the times, places, and manner, remember that, of holding elections for senator and representatives, it also permits Congress to make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. Thus, the federal government doesn't just have nearly complete authority to regulate congressional elections, it explicitly has the power to displace state laws. And yet, as Franita Tolson, a law professor at the University of Southern California and a leading expert on the federal government's power to regulate elections, explained in a recent testimony before Congress, Shelby County ignored that the Elections Clause stands as an additional source of authority, which can justify federal anti-discrimination and voting rights legislation. The impact of Shelby County was fairly swift. In 2013, for example, Texas enacted racially gerrymandered legislative maps, even though the federal court had rejected many key elements of those maps under Voting Rights Act preclearance provisions. Yet, with preclearance dead, the Supreme Court upheld nearly all of Texas's gerrymandered maps in Abbott versus Perez in 2018. Right? When preclearance still existed, they told Texas, no way, these maps just don't cut it. You can't do this. They're too racially gerrymandered. So they put the maps away. They didn't burn them. They put them away and waited for the court to invalidate the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and then took them out of cold storage and said, well, now can we pass these things? And they said, I guess you can, because the court did away with the preclearance. And the only people who said that these things were too badly racially gerrymandered were the voting rights attorneys at the Department of Justice, and we're not listening to them anymore. So no one's on the record saying that they're too racially discriminatory, so go for it. Similarly, if preclearance were still in effect, it is unlikely that many of the controversial provisions of Georgia's recently enacted voter suppression law would survive, and certainly no federal official acting in good faith would permit Georgia to simply start closing down polling places in black neighborhoods. It's the sort of thing that strikes you as obviously illegal and unconstitutional, except that you forgot the part about where they got rid of those parts of the Constitution and the law. Alito's opinion in Brnovich pays no more heed to the text of the Voting Rights Act than Roberts' opinion in Shelby County paid to the Constitution. That case involved two interlocking provisions of the Voting Rights Act. One prohibits any law that results in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. Seems pretty obvious, right? The other provides that the Voting Rights Act is violated if Based on the totality of circumstances, it's shown that the political process is leading to nomination or election in the state or political subdivision are not equally open to participation by voters of color, or if such voters have less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice, like there are no voting machines in their city. That's a lot of thick legal language, but one searches in vain for anything suggesting, as Alito wrote in Brnovich, that election practices that were common in 1982 are presumptively legal. I don't know, it's a long time ago. Are you sure? Maybe they were discriminatory in ways that we didn't recognize as discriminatory then, but recognize now. Nope. If it's good enough for our founding fathers, that is to say people in 1982, then it's good enough for us. What? Or, as he suggested in Brnovich, also suggested, that state election rules are presumptively lawful so long as they supposedly combat voter fraud. As Rick Hasen, law professor and election law expert at the University of California at Irvine, writes in Slate, Brnovich ignores the text of the statute, its comparative focus on lessened opportunity for minority voters, and the history that showed Congress intended to alter the status quo and give new protections to minority voters. Alito's opinion in Brnovich bears the same resemblance to the text of the Voting Rights Act that Taco Bell does to Mexico. Yeah. Just as significantly, Brnovich raises serious doubts about whether this Supreme Court would strike down any state election law that discriminates on the basis of race. One thing that surprised me, that would be Ian, after Brnovich was handed down, is that my initial assessment of the opinion was slightly more optimistic than the view among many voting rights scholars, including Tolson and Hasen. I wrote that the Supreme Court left the Voting Rights Act alive in Brnovich, if only barely. Hasen, by contrast, accused Alito of essentially offering a new and impossible test for the plaintiffs to meet if they alleged that they were denied the right to vote. Tolson told the legal podcast Strict Scrutiny that it's very difficult to determine what voting restrictions would violate the standard laid out in Brnovich. So let me, that would be Ian again, lay out the case for why Brnovich and the array of Roberts Court decisions limiting voting rights that preceded it may not produce an apocalyptic crisis for American democracy. This argument has three prongs. The first is that while Alito's opinion in Brnovich imposes a long list of extra-textual limits on the Voting Rights Act, it doesn't go quite as far as the Republican Party asked the court to go. The Arizona Republican Party's brief in Brnovich argued that race-neutral regulations of the where, when, and how of voting do not violate the act. A proposal that, as Kagan pointed out in oral argument, would allow a state to require all voters to cast their ballot at a country club, for instance. Meanwhile, Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich suggested, and he's a Republican, by the way, in case you didn't know, suggested that voting restrictions that have a disproportionate impact on minority voters should be upheld, so long as the state didn't cause voters of color to behave differently than white voters. Thus, under Brnovich's standard, a state could potentially limit the franchise to country music fans, because the state didn't cause white people to be more likely to listen to country music than voters of color. Republicans, in other words, gave the Supreme Court two different legal standards that it could have applied to Brnovich if the court wanted to effectively neutralize the Voting Rights Act altogether. The fact that the court rejected these proposed standards in an opinion that was otherwise completely shameless about its disregard for what the law actually says suggests that some key members of the court may have balked at the GOP's request to shut down the Voting Rights Act altogether. The second reason for optimism, which Millhiser showed initially, right? While Republican state lawmakers have enacted a bevy of voting restrictions in the wake of decisions like Shelby County, most of those restrictions have not had as drastic an impact on voting as many advocates feared. Voter ID laws, for example, which require voters to show photo ID before they can cast a ballot, are a common voter restriction favored by many Republicans, yet while initial research on voter ID suggested that these laws may disproportionately prevent left-leaning demographics from casting a ballot, more recent research suggests that they have no impact whatsoever. Well, that's good news. They appear to neither diminish voter turnout, as Democrats feared, nor have any real impact on voter fraud, which Republicans often highlight to justify such laws, even though voter fraud is exceedingly rare. Similarly, a recent paper by political scientists Maya Komisarchik, I guess that's probably close as I can get with that, and Ariel White, finds that Shelby County did not reduce aggregate Black or Hispanic voter registration or turnout, and the turnout among these voters may have even slightly increased since the court's decision in 2013, an unexpected finding that the authors think may be attributable, at least in part, to voter turnout efforts explicitly targeted to counter potential voter suppression in the wake of the decision. That could be. I want to be cautious about being too optimistic here, as the court's decision in Perez suggests even if eliminating preclearance did not diminish voter registration or turnout, it has made it easier for states to enact racial gerrymanders. And even if Democrats and voting rights advocates have thus far succeeded in countering Shelby through counter-mobilization efforts, it's unclear if those efforts will remain successful forever. Shelby County is also less than a decade old, so it remains to be seen what impact more innovative voter suppression laws, such as the one recently enacted in Georgia, will have on turnout. But that brings us to a third reason to be cautiously optimistic, as Nicholas Stephanopoulos, a Harvard election law professor, wrote shortly after Brnovich came down, that decision does not preclude challenges to novel or unusual voting restrictions because such restrictions weren't prevalent in 1982. The more creative Republican lawmakers get in their efforts to restrict the vote, the more likely it is that the courts will balk. And lastly here, I think, two unanswered questions. We'll see if we can get through them here. The biggest threat facing American democracy is that state lawmakers may go beyond restrictions such as voter ID, which make it harder for some voters to cast a ballot, and actually impose election rules that make it impossible for Democrats to win. Think of former President Donald Trump's failed attempts to pressure judges, state officials, and Congress into tossing out President Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election. Last year, the Supreme Court literally did the least that it could possibly do to preserve democracy in the United States by turning aside frivolous lawsuits brought by Republicans seeking to overturn Biden's victory. But future efforts to rig elections are likely to be more subtle, and the lawyers who defend those efforts are likely to be more competent than the band of misfits Trump assembled to challenge the 2020 election. We don't yet know how the courts will approach those efforts. Consider, for example, Georgia's new law. The most troubling provision of that law permits Republican officials to seize control of local election boards that have the power to close down polling locations and disqualify voters. There's a novel form of voter suppression. It's unlikely that many states permitted partisan officials to simply toss out Democratic ballots in 1982. Now, that's a standard somehow. And the court's decision in Brnovich should not prevent courts from intervening if Georgia Republicans go that far. But here's the rub. Imagine that Georgia's Republicans start shutting down polling precincts in the largely Democratic majority black city of Atlanta shortly before the 2022 election. Or imagine that, say, Arizona passes a new law 1 month before the election that shuts down half the precincts in Democratic neighborhoods. The court's decision in Purcell held that judges should be reluctant to intervene in election-related disputes as Election Day draws close, because such decisions can themselves result in voter confusion and consequent incentive to remain away from the polls. Yet more recent decisions have treated Purcell less as a practical warning that judges should avoid decisions that might confuse voters, and more like an inexorable rule that late-breaking voting rights decisions are not allowed. I don't think that was meant to be the intent. The danger, in other words, is that if a state imposes last-minute voting restrictions that seek to rig an election, the Supreme Court may forbid the federal judiciary from doing anything about it. Another unanswered question, how far this court is willing to go in giving Republicans an unfair advantage during the next legislative redistricting cycle, which is expected to begin this fall. In a long line of cases stretching back more than a century, the Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected something known as the independent state legislature doctrine, which could potentially allow state legislatures to pass election laws that can neither be vetoed by a state governor nor reviewed by the state's courts. But 4 members of the court recently endorsed this doctrine, and newly confirmed Justice Amy Coney Barrett's views on the doctrine are unknown. Imagine that, passing a new set of districts that are racially discriminatory on their face, but the law that enacts them purports to prevent legislatures from readdressing them or courts from reviewing them. Are those things legal? What if it's all done within the requisite period of time right before an election and the federal judiciary is not even allowed to ask that question? They're really doing everything they can to engineer this thing so that there's no way for them to lose. And I guess about time for us, those of us listening to the show, I think, already realizing. Time to see if we can make future signers of joint letters to the Senate realize it, perhaps.
You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, time to wrap up, and still plenty of material left for tomorrow's show. Hopefully all goes well, and we can bring you the rest of that. Now time for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. Starting off right at the top of the summary here, audio recordings of New York Times reporters Carol Leonig and Phil Rucker's interviews with Donald Trump is like listening to Nixon drunk rambling.